I'm just the facilitator of the ISERM's Living Together movement, which is just one of our projects. I'm going to introduce Priscilla Prutzman. Priscilla is the co-founder and executive director of Creative Response to Conflict. She has an MA in Communications and Media Studies from the New School for Social Research. She has written numerous curricula, books, articles, including The Friendly Classroom for a Small Planet. She has received awards for her work in bias awareness, which is our topic for this brief interview, and conflict resolution from the National Conference on Peacemaking and Conflict Resolution, the National Peace Foundation, the Peace and Justice Studies Association, and the Association for Conflict Resolution. Her organization, based in Nyack, New York, is called, once again, Creative Response to Conflict. CRC's organizational mission is to achieve a nonviolent and just world by helping people learn to resolve conflict through cooperation, communication, affirmation, bias awareness, creative responses to bullying, and creative problem-solving skills and mediation. So basically, Priscilla, I would like you to give us just an overview of your bias awareness model that you've been developing through the years.
This model, actually, I don't know if everybody can see this, but I'll read it over, was originally a two-day, that we're doing in about 20 minutes, a two-day session that was developed way back during the Mayor Dinkins administration in New York City. So we basically were dealing in a very pluralistic New York City environment. And the idea really was to create more understanding between many, many different cultures, and also to create 1,000 people who were trained in good bias awareness techniques and who also were trained in conflict resolution. So this is a short version of the model that we continue to use. We start with a gathering globe go around. Usually we do this in a circle, and we'd ask everybody to say a little bit about their heritage, their background, including maybe where they were born, if they know that, and what cultures they identify with, okay? And then we'd review the agenda and get their approval for it. And we talk about some concepts and guidelines for the work that we'd be doing. And some of those concepts and guidelines include everybody has bias. Everybody has experienced bias against them. There's going to be mistakes that are made when we deal with bias awareness. We can't just all of a sudden become bias-free. We're not really going to become bias-free, but we need to be aware of them. Another concept is that the more we know about our own culture, the more likely it is we'll want to learn more about other cultures and hopefully open our minds to other cultures and realize that there are lots of different ways of doing things and looking at the world. So we're all biased. We all have bias, experienced bias. That's a really important thing to remember, and that creates a mood where everybody can feel free to talk about biases, okay? Then we would do a warm-up activity, concentric circles, and we'd ask people to think about communication styles and why do you think biases happen? What do you think's at the root of being biased? And that gets people thinking about everything. Then we would brainstorm isms or biases using the definition power plus the prejudice equals the ism. So what are some examples of isms? Racism. Sexism. Ageism. What else? Classism. What else?
Did we say sexism?
Nativism.
Okay. So, yes, we said sexism. Okay. And homophobia or heterosexism. Okay. And religious bias. Often people forget religious bias is one of the biggest biases. We also, at some point, talk about hate crimes. In the United States, the FBI tracks hate crimes. What do you think the biggest group of targets are for hate crimes? What do you think?
I think it's Muslims.
Okay, many people will say it's Muslims, okay? Religious bias is currently the third biggest hate crime that's done. However, it is not mostly against Muslims. It's mostly against Jewish people. Okay, the anti-Semitism is a much higher rate, okay, than it is anti-Muslim. Even after 9/11, there were more anti-Semitic responses. Yes?
And also anti-black violence, which also is unreported.
Anti-black bias is the number one, okay? And oftentimes people forget that. Particularly young African-American males have tremendous attacks toward them. By far the biggest one. Out of 7,000 hate crimes reported, 5,000 of them might be directed against young black men, okay? So that's by far number one. It used to be number two was bias against religion. Now that's number three. And what do you think number two is? Yes, gay, anti-gay violence. And of that category, which group do you think there's the most attacks against? Well, interestingly enough, they just added trans this past recording. Before it was included. But within anti-gay violence, it's predominantly gay men who, that way higher figures, just as anti-Semitism is way higher in religious bias, okay? So we could do a whole thing on that, but we will talk about hate crimes. So back to the model. We'll look at personal, cultural, and institutional forms of an ism that we would look at. So let's say that we chose religious bias. What would a personal example of religious bias be?
I'm uncomfortable around Jews.
Okay, a personal comment,
Yeah,
all right?
something like that, yeah.
All right, so a personal form of anti-religious bias or anti-Semitism would be a personal comment like that. Okay, and then a cultural bias would be a cultural assumption about a certain religion. What would an example about that be? What would be a cultural stereotype, a cultural assumption of a good student, okay? All right. And then an institutional bias would be any bias that's related to some kind of an institution, such as, well, not so much anymore, but maybe Jewish people wouldn't be allowed in a certain kind of country club. Okay, that would be an institutional form of bias. Yes?
I would say also another common one that's kind of brought, so we're talking about institutional bias is just the fact that typically there's no special day for Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, or sometimes the ending of Ramadan.
Yes.
Or when people attend public school or stay on campus and they must have a meal plan and there's a lack of halal meat or kosher foods. Same thing even in prison. So they kind of do the best that they can.
Yes, excellent examples of institutional forms of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, basically. Okay? So we would go down the list and make all kinds of examples of that, and then we would go into other isms, okay? And then we would look at a time that I experienced bias against me. Again, thinking everybody here has experienced some kind of bias, okay? So we would, in small groups, share what's the time that you experienced bias. And that gives us the opportunity to hear other examples of bias, and it's very, very empathy producing. And that's really what the goal of this whole process is to help produce empathy as well as understanding as well as knowledge of many different cultures, okay? So then, and this is one we're going to do today, we practice interrupting bias. This is something that is so important for everybody to learn the skills of interrupting bias. Now, why is it that people don't tend to interrupt bias? What are reasons for just being silent and doing nothing? People are scared. Okay, people might be embarrassed. They might be afraid, whatever reason, okay? They may not see it. That's probably more often than not, people are not even understanding the bias, and that's why the personal, cultural, institutional is so important to do here. Okay, so we're going to come back to that and actually practice that. And then we would go into a very theoretical piece called Behaviors of Power Groups and Behaviors of Non-Power Groups. And we would ask people to think, in which groups are you a member of a power group, and which group are you a member of a non-power group, okay? And then we would go over a theoretical description of how people act. And that very much gets into the ones that aren't always seen as well, you know? And then we'd talk about allied behavior. If you hear somebody else making a prejudiced remark, what can you do as an ally to step in and change that? And then we would look at what can we do to create safer and more welcoming communities and workplaces wherever we are. And that, hopefully, we'll have time to do that today. But let's go back now to interrupting biased comments. Has anyone here ever successfully interrupted a biased comment? Yes, what did you do?
Me?
Yes, and then we'll come back to you.
Somebody was getting harassed for being Muslim, and I would suggest that wasn't a good idea.
Okay, not a good idea. I'm just.
Well, I basically said it was pretty damn rude and so forth.
Okay, now in all transparency, we do come out of a nonviolent tradition, so our program was started by the Quakers in 1972, and so even though that might have felt good, or to say something about being rude, would you feel that comment would have ended up having a good relationship with that person?
At the moment, I really didn't care.
Right, exactly. And it probably didn't improve the relationship.
Well, it stopped the person from making...
It stopped it, yeah. It stopped it. Yeah, and that's a response that if nothing else feels like it would work for you, it's better to do that than do nothing at all. Because if we do nothing at all, what's going to happen? It's going to increase, it's going to happen again. I mean, when you think of a continuum of making a small comment, the other end of the continuum is a hate crime, basically. So doing something is better than doing nothing, that's for sure. So, keeping in mind nonviolent responses, has anyone else successfully interrupted a biased comment? Yes?
I guess mine is not a story, but I guess it was very good. So when I was a student in Bulgaria back in the 1990s, there was a that city which was against autism and anybody who's not a white person. And they had an organization that was called the Great Macedonian Republic. Great Macedonian Republic. So they put posters all over the place. And I know that they knew that I was mad. So I found a very thick black marker. I put in my pocket. Whenever I see a sign, I would write in there, great fools. So once I was in my department, and there was this poster there, I wrote great fools. And I was standing there, a new Nazi guy came, watched this, he was so mad, he repeated himself. I'm like, good.
Okay, I'm not sure I caught all that.
He defaced it so that the neo-Nazi looked it up himself.
Oh, okay. So in a sense, you transformed the whole thing. Yeah, it's like an Aikido response. Has anyone here ever studied Aikido? Yeah, it's like it's the conflict resolution tool. You get in close to the conflict and you take them off balance. Okay, I'll just call that an Aikido response or an off balance. Okay, very good. Anybody else have a story of how you successfully interrupted? Yes? Uh-huh.
One was in a state in the southern part of the United States. I just did a negotiation for them, and they paid millions of dollars. I was taken to lunch by the mayor of that particular city, on Main City, and two other notables. And one person said, I'm Cuban-American, from New England. And the person said, how do you deal with those Jews up in New York?
And so
How do you deal with all those Jews up in New York? And I responded by saying the same way I deal with you.
Okay.
And the second instance was when I was at the United Nations. I was a principal accredited representative from the National NAACP, the only Latino there. And I was having a meeting with somebody from a particular European country, unnamed, and the person made a derisive comment about persons from Ghana. And I said, I don't know how you can stand dealing with all those Ghanaians. They're always trying to do a sharp deal. A sharp deal is a negotiation that is unfair. And I said, they do the same thing you do. And he was quiet and he said, nothing. But he understood the point in both cases.
Okay. Okay, so those two responses were a little bit similar. So the same thing. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
two situations, the same situation, but two different populations being attacked.
Yeah.
And who was the person who said if somebody attacks one group, all groups are at risk?
Yes. Martin Nebro. Yeah. Yeah. First they came for the. Yeah. Okay. One more. Yes.
Just not anything like terribly specific, but just I've had a lot of friends that have made like rude or biased comments, and I've just said that's not. I don't think you have the correct information, and I just simply explained the correct information so that it made it easier for them to see why what they were saying was being either generalizing or racist because they had the wrong information and they just couldn't understand that what they were saying was being viewed by other people that do have the correct information as incorrect or wrong. Racist.
That's great. Giving correct information, listening to what they're saying, paraphrase it back, and then suggesting alternatives or giving information. That's something that this process we've taught to kindergarten children. Okay, and the earlier we teach this, the better they get it and the faster they get it. It's harder to teach adults this, really. Okay, and if you're not sure what to do at all, you can ask a question and keep asking questions. Okay? And you can say how you feel. You can make an I statement. I feel really uncomfortable when I hear that kind of a comment because, and I would really appreciate not hearing those kind of comments, okay? Another one that's helpful often is how would you feel if your group were attacked? That works really well with fourth graders. They're really into justice issues, So how would you feel, okay? All right, and then the redirecting, those are fun. Those are real fun. Okay, so what are some kinds of put-downs that you might hear? Well, any of the ones that you said could be an example. Okay, but what kinds of put-downs?
Negative comments.
Yeah, negative comments, put-downs, biased comments. What do we hear these days?
They're all really violent.
They're all violent, okay? Okay, there go the terrorists. In a school in Brooklyn, that was one, we came in and did this model because they were, kindergarten children were making those comments. There go the terrorists, okay? And these were the techniques that we practiced, okay? So what I'd like everybody to do is get a chance to practice this, okay? So we're gonna do this in pairs. And one person will make a comment, any one of the ones that was said. It could have to do, it could be the "that's so gay" comment, which we still hear in schools. It could be the "there go the terrorists" comment, okay? And one of you is going to make the comment, and then the other one is going to try to use one of these tools to respond to it, okay? And then you'll switch roles. But it's more fun to do this if we all stand up and find a partner, decide who's going to make the comment first. So everybody stand up, find a partner. Okay, and if you can stand back to back, raise your hand if you're going to make the comment. Okay. Okay, if your hand is up, you're making the comment. Okay, on the count of three, you're going to turn around, make the comment, and the other person is going to interrupt it. You ready? Everybody know what we're doing? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Turn around, make the comment. Just come look up front for a minute. Hello? Okay, did anybody do anything that's not on our board? Did anybody respond in a way that's not on our board? Anybody want to share? Yes, you do.
She probed into my background to see why I'd make a racist comment.
Okay, probing into your background.
Yeah,
Okay.
I really resisted it.
Okay. All right. So you kept asking questions, basically.
Experiences in the past. Just wondering.
Okay. Any others that were different? Okay, so now if you turn back to back one more time, if you gave the put down, this time you make the response. So turn around. Turn around. All right? And 1, 2, 3, reverse roles. Okay, if everybody could have a seat. Please have a seat. Thank you. Okay. So, anybody have a different response you'd like to share? Did anybody do something this time that was different, that hasn't been talked about, or that was not on the board? Any responses? Yes. Empathy. Uh-huh.
I think the example was Native Americans and they're always alcoholics, casinos, and I said, yeah, they've really been through a lot, haven't they?
Okay.
Kind of like trying to bridge a gap in understanding.
Okay. What'd you do?
And my partner, I didn't do it, but she asked, well, how would you feel if you weren't elected? So it was actually reflecting back on empathy, the same kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, that's a really intense response to saying, how would you feel if your group, were attacked? Okay? Anybody else want to share? Yes.
I got angry and it was not helpful.
Yeah, again, these are based on a conflict resolution model, really, where you want to maintain the relationship. And we know that getting angry, yelling at the person, giving a put down back, what they used to call shooting the dozens, you make a higher and higher amount of put down. That's really going to escalate the situation, and the harder it's going to be to maintain that friendship, isn't it? Yeah.
Your model is where people somehow want to maintain a relationship, but somebody made a remark which really the other person feels does not belong there. But my model is you have the demonstrators on one side, the demonstrators on the other side, screaming at each other, and with the police in the middle.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, that's where we started, because our program was built by Quaker Project on Community Conflict, and that's exactly what we did. We trained people how do you respond if a police is coming at you with a club, and how do you de-escalate the situation? And that's part of a conflict resolution. Being able to de-escalate the situation is a really, really important skill, particularly for young black men these days. We're thinking of actually starting programs where we basically role play like it's being in the civil rights movement, because we need to know those de-escalating tools to keep people alive in these days, Yeah.
I was in an experience like that. This was in front of Schumer's office. These were demonstrations for or against him supporting the Iran deal.
Oh, yeah.
And we were marching back and forth, but the groups got mingled. And it was very interesting. And some of the signs were so unclear, you didn't know quite what they were supporting. But we got some conversations going. How did you get here? Did you drive or something like that? And some decent conversations really did develop.
Well, that's an interesting dialogue tool. I've never done that before.
The police were there to make sure that nobody...
Yeah.
But he focused on what was common among them, and that was people gathered together, and they had to get there somehow. I mean, it was a commonality. It was kind of silly, but that's the idea.
Yeah. Yes, and then.
What's funny was that I get the same, what she threw to me was the same biased comment that I always get. And that's where you from originally. I mean, I know New York is a melting pot, and it's, so how I always respond, and I know she gets that too, she told me the same comment, is I answer them where I'm originally from, and but I know I'm over 30 more years here, and where my parents are from, but I threw back the question. question to them, and so, what about you? Where are you from? I mean, just because you're not blonde and white, you assume you're not from here. So you immediately I always throw them back the question, what about you? Where are you from? Even if she's blonde and white.
And that's great, and that's asking a question. It's asking an objective question, and it's not really putting them down, but it's sure it's making you feel a lot better, right?
But what that question, because I'm guilty of that, I ask a lot of people where they're from, and I'm just genuinely interested, and I'm actually, I don't know. So that's a tough one, because I understand that the perception depends on the person you're asking. So it's hard to differentiate, and sometimes people like the question. So what are the thoughts on that?
It's complimentary if someone asks you where you're from, because they're genuinely interested in you.
Depends on how it's asked.
Depends. Yeah. Well, that's one of those things where, we might not always be aware of what's biased. That's a perfect example of that. And that's why having these discussions is so important, because I'm sure there are lots of people that are really tired of being asked where they're from.
And that's it. I think it's the assumption that you're not from here that one senses that feels like a bias.
Yeah.
Not a question of genuine curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm born in America, I'm part Native American, and people often ask me where I'm from. And I just take it as an opportunity to tell them I'm very American. So I don't know. I think there's an opportunity in there too.
No question.
You don't
There's
get
always
it.
an opportunity.
You don't get it. Are you really?
Mars, really.
Now, why does negative peace come in? Because there are some folks, that's wonderful idea. The more you try that, they just keep going. It's like putting fire under them to even get going more. How do you handle those folks?
Well, that's why the question thing is good. To just keep asking, calmly keep asking the same question.
And the
over
more
and
you
over.
ask, the more they don't get excited. Because
But that doesn't mean you have to get excited. 'Cause then-
I saw this.
Okay, if everybody could have a seat. Please have a seat. Thank you. Okay. So, anybody have a different response you'd like to share? Did anybody do something this time that was different, that hasn't been talked about, or that was not on the board? Any responses? Yes. Empathy. Uh-huh.
The example was Native Americans and alcoholics, casinos, and I said, yeah, they really been through a lot, haven't they?
Okay. Okay. What'd you do?
My partner, I didn't do it, but she asked, well, how would you feel if you weren't elected? So it was actually reflecting back on empathy, the same kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, that's a really intense response to say, and how would you feel if your group, were attacked? Okay? Anybody else want to share? Yes.
I got angry and it was not helpful.
Yeah, again, these are based on a conflict resolution model, really, where you want to maintain the relationship. And we know that getting angry, yelling at the person, giving a put down back, what they used to call shooting the dozens. You make a higher and higher amount of put down. That's really going to escalate the situation, and the harder it's going to be to maintain that friendship, isn't it? Yeah.
I think your model is where people somehow want to maintain a relationship, but somebody made a remark which really the other person feels does not belong there. But my model is you have the demonstrators on one side, the demonstrators on the other side, screaming at each other, and with the police in the middle.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, that's where we started, because our program was built by Quaker Project on Community Conflict, and that's exactly what we did. We trained people how do you respond if a police is coming at you with a club, and you know, how do you de-escalate the situation? And that's part of a conflict resolution. Being able to de-escalate the situation is a really, really important skill, particularly for young black men these days. You know, we're thinking of actually starting programs where, you know, we basically role play like it's being in the civil rights movement, you know, because we need to know those de-escalating tools to keep people alive in these days, you know? Yeah.
I was in an experience like that. This was in front of Schumer's office. These were demonstrations for or against him supporting the Iran deal.
Oh, yeah.
And we were marching back and forth, but the groups got mingled. And it was very interesting. And some of the signs were so unclear, you didn't know quite what they were supporting. But we got some conversations going. You know, how did you get here? Did you drive or something like that? and some decent conversations really did develop.
Well, that's an interesting dialogue tool. I've never done that before.
And the police were there to make sure that nobody...
Yeah, yeah.
But you know, he focused on what was common among them, and that was people gathered together, and they had to get there somehow. I mean, it was a commonality. It's kind of silly, but yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah. Yes, and then.
What's funny was that I get the same, what she threw to me was the same biased comment that I always get. And that's where you from originally. I mean, I know New York is about to be packed, you know, and it's, so how I always respond, and I know she gets that too, she told me the same comment, is I answer them where I'm originally from, and you know, like I know I'm over 30 more years here, and where my parents are from, but I threw back the question to them, and so what about you, where are you from? I mean, just because you're not blonde and white, you know, you assume you're not from here, so you immediately I always throw them back the question, what about you, where are you from? Even if she's blonde or white.
And that's great, and that's asking a question. It's asking an objective question, and it's not really putting them down, but you know, it's sure it's making you feel a lot better, right?
But what that question, because I'm guilty of that. I ask a lot of people where they're from, and I'm just genuinely interested, you know, and I actually. I don't know. So that's a tough one because I understand that the perception depends on the person you're asking. So it's hard to differentiate, and sometimes people like the question. So what are the thoughts on that?
It's complimentary if someone asks you where you're from because they're genuinely interested in you.
Depends on how it's asked.
Depends.
Yeah. Well, that's one of those things where, you know, we might not always be aware of what's biased. You know, that's a perfect example of that. And that's why having these discussions is so important, because I'm sure there are lots of people that are really tired of being asked where they're from.
And that's it. I think it's the assumption that you're not from here that one senses that feels like a bias.
Yeah.
Not a question of genuine curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm born in American. I'm part Native American, and people often ask me where I'm from. And I just take it as an opportunity to tell them I'm very American, you know. So I don't know. I think there's an opportunity in there too.
No question.
You
There's
don't get
always
it.
an opportunity.
You don't get it. Are you really?
Mars, yeah.
One of those negative peace come in. Because some folks, that's wonderful idea. The more you try that, they just keep going. It's like putting fire on the dam to even get going more. How do you handle those folks?
Well, that's why the question thing is good. To just keep asking, calmly keep asking the same question.
And the
over
more
and
you
over again.
ask, the more they get excited. Because
But that doesn't mean you have to get excited. Were you trying to say something, Penny?
Yeah, I was going to throw out a different kind of example, which I think is really toughism. We have a very inclusive church, and it happens to be very autistic friendly. And we had a substitute organist a few weeks ago, and who was candidating, and because we do have lots of little kids and autistic kids and stuff, it gets noisy at times, and the organist turned around like this when there was noise, and I got really offended because this is something that we really embrace. And so afterward, I said, one of the things in our church that we appreciate so much is that we enjoy the noise. And if that's something that you can't live with, then maybe you shouldn't be candidating here. And I think that this is a very appropriate subject right now because of what I understand happened on Broadway the other night. I don't know if anybody heard about the incident at King and I, but there was an autistic kid that got very agitated when there was the beating scene with the woman, and the kid got very upset, and people really buzzing around and got very furious with the mom and with the kid. And so the guy playing the lead stopped the show and allowed the woman to take the child out, and then really banged over the audience after they left the room and said that was inappropriate. Well, first I'm thinking, yay, yes, that's wonderful. And then I'm thinking, but she had to leave. They had to leave. And so you have that up against the fact that people pay a lot of money for tickets and they want to be able to hear. And it's a tough one as we work through all of the stuff that we have about disabilities of all kinds. That really is one that kind of gets us in the face. But that was brought home to me in that incident at home.
Yeah, and the disability and differently abled issues often go unrecognized, as a lot of biases do. But, particularly that bias because people are not aware of what's going on. So thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
Priscilla, so we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
And I would just like to segue into the last part that we were going to talk about, how do we form safer communities.
Great.
And also kind of sort of merge that into the question and answer session. So if you guys want to merge that together. Okay, safer communities. How do we make our communities more safe? How do we make them more welcoming? And again, this is just a segue into the question and answer part of, we have about 10 minutes, and you can also just build on everything else that we've talked about. So
yes, and I can board these. What are some ways that we can make people feel more welcome? Yes.
I think integration and communication is the main priority for building a safe community, because the more you know the others, then the more you humanize them and you feel safer.
So Kathy added working on starting the peace within ourselves.
Okay, what else? What else could we do? Yes.
One of the things I'm thinking about that came out earlier today is that if you have a specific group that you're including, that you become less violent. And I'm thinking that if a group specifically goes after particular populations, particular people, to draw them in, that becomes a safer.
Where we will offer free belly dancing classes.
Let's go. multicultural groups, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and deliberately drawing people in.
Okay.
So Penny, your name is Penny, right? Yeah, she added deliberately putting yourself within multicultural scenarios and environments, right?
What else?
What about acting contrary to perceptions? For example, sometimes mediators who call themselves conciliators will act in a non-conciliatory way right off the bat to get rid of that notion that they're just wimps. And I think it's kind of a thing where they act contrary to the perception.
Okay.
Act contrary to perception? On purpose?
That could backfire, but if you have a handle on it and know where you're going with it and have a dialogue afterwards to explain what you were doing, then that could reduce stereotypes. Yes?
Another one I found that's really penetrating for me is when people I look people in the eye and they look me in the eye. That my eyes don't deviate, that not everybody's not looking around the room, that builds some sort of bond and acceptance just beyond.
Okay. And that has to be
So
appropriate
conscious
eye
nonverbal
contact.
communication?
And that has to be appropriate eye contact. Certainly there's some
Exactly.
cultures where looking directly in the eye could be seen as a threat or rude even, whereas, appropriate eye contact, which might be looking away occasionally. So I'll just put it down as appropriate eye contact.
So then we can build off of that and go back to what we talked about this morning with cultural sensitivities and also education, because if all we ever read are reading materials that reinforce our own knowledge, then we're not really expanding much. So
yes.
I'm thinking in particular, since the murder of the 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, the Black Lives Matter movement has exploded since then. So now we have the demonized cop. And so the cops are all now, for a great segment of our population, particularly the young, the black, the brown, and many others are demonized. So, we don't want to paint all cops with one brush stroke, but where is a safe space? So my suggestion is creating safe spaces for the othered to speak with anonymity and immunity and be able to express issues they have, because from the cops that I know, they don't feel comfortable to speak at all against fellow police officers. One told me, for example, confidentially, he's in NYPD, he said 2 out of 10 NYPD should go. And NYPD is probably a whole lot better than, a lot of other police forces. So we need to create safe spaces so that those communities themselves can work out their issues.
So
Okay,
Susan, would you
dialoguing.
call that effective community policing? Would it come under that title?
Community policing often, means
It's a buzzword, yeah.
it also refers to people policing their own communities, and so that would be, for example, you have ethnic groups, like Memphis, 80% black, the force is 80% black, the police force. But here we're talking about, I'm talking about police in general being seen as, a brutal part of the system by young people.
So one of the things that Omaha, believe it or not, a place where I used to live, has done, and many communities around the country have done, is take police out of the policing context. So they're at the ice cream social on a Sunday afternoon. They are, they're just example after example of where they're actually in their uniform, and so I think it helps community members kind of sort of take away some of the stigma of that blue curtain that we know exists. And so it's kind of decontextualizing that scary part of the police.
But that's part of it, and that's really important. But, so here is a bias, there's extreme anti-cop bias in this country. So how can we create an opportunity for police officers to address this internally without them feeling that they're going to be, picked on for betraying their fellow officers?
So confidential dialogue.
Okay, so it is time for
is
us to
time,
wrap
okay.
up. Are there any final comments you want to make, Priscilla, or a summation of any kind? We're going to take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll proceed with the last part of the day.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, there's lots more. I happen to have one copy of Behaviors of Power and Non-Power if anybody wants it, or if anybody would like more on bias awareness. If you give me your card, I can email it to you. Our website is crc-global.org. I can put that right here, crc-global.org. And you could also email me, prutzman@crc-global.org if you want any more materials on anything. And the last thing I want to say is if you could each visualize one thing that you're going to do on this list to help reduce biases, and what's one thing you can take from this short session and say, what are you going to do yourself personally? Okay, you don't have to share that now, but just think about that, okay? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Priscilla.